Okay, so we have set the stage in section 2 for Paul's first letter, which was to the Thessalonians. And we've talked about Thessalonica a bit and Silas, his close companion. And so what we're going to look at is two different emotions that Paul had regarding the Thessalonians and also some purposes for writing. You'll recall that he had to leave in haste, went to Berea, then to Athens, then to Corinth. And Silas and Timothy then came to him in Corinth and gave him an update, which led to him writing and sending that letter back to the Thessalonians. So the first emotion was being eager to hear about how the Thessalonians are doing. And the difference between being eager and being anxious is that anxious has a little bit more worry in it. And so both of these emotions are given in the first letter, and we'll see that tomorrow. But he's both eager and anxious, and there's two reasons why he would have been eager. The first was that he had left in haste quickly. You'll recall that they had assaulted the house of Jason. He was able to flee by the grace of God and move on to Berea. And he didn't have any time to sit down with these new converts and talk to them about how they needed to go live going forward. And so he left in haste, and that would have led to a level of eagerness. He also wondered if his labors were in vain. Are they going to receive my message? Are they going to go back to the way it was before? A lot of concern, as you can imagine, in the mind of Paul. He also would have been very anxious about the Thessalonians, and this is a little bit stronger emotion. This church is composed mostly of Gentiles. We learned that from verse 9 of chapter 1. And so as Gentiles, they had a little bit different background than the Jews. So these recent converts were facing persecution and basically being questioned for their faith. But probably a little bit more important than that was that they were tempted to leave their former sinful lives. This church is about 3 months old. And if you would compare that to a church like Zion, which has been around for a couple of years now, but when Zion was 3 months old, and if you would compare that to the Thessalonian church when they were 3 months old, you probably would know that there's a big difference. The members of Zion came from other churches, they grew up in the faith, whereas these Thessalonians are hearing the message for the very first time. And so Paul left quickly, and then Silas and Timothy left, and so there's definitely going to be a level of anxiousness by Paul. Basically, how are they doing? So, to summarize that, there's really no time, very little time, for this young church to be firmly grounded in the truth, because Paul had to leave early. So, both eager and anxious. And tomorrow in class, we'll look at examples from 1 Thessalonians that deal with proving those two emotions. The next thing is the purposes for Paul writing, and there are 4 of them. And this will be common for our letters, that there will be purposes. First one is to encourage them to remain loyal in persecution, because many of them were experiencing that persecution. We read that in the first letter. Secondly, he wanted to exhort them to holiness of living. And exhort means command and encourage, kind of simultaneously, but more commanding. And the idea was that the Gentiles, again, would have had a background that was not holy living. So he needed to encourage them in that respect. Defend himself against slander, and this is going to be a common theme that we'll look at because, remember, Paul's background is a persecutor. So he constantly has to deal with what he did in the past, and many, specifically Jews, will disqualify him from being an apostle. And so he's going to defend himself, but more importantly, he's going to defend his apostleship as coming from Jesus Christ. And then the fourth purpose has to do with relieving their anxiousness about his teaching of the second coming of Christ. And this is a major theme in 1 Thessalonians and also in 2 Thessalonians. Basically, the Thessalonians had 2 misunderstandings. One was that their dead relatives would not see Christ, and that's what he's going to deal with here in this letter. And in the second letter, he's going to deal with the fact that the second coming of Christ is sudden, which is something they also struggled with. Now we're going to talk about the report in more detail tomorrow, but for now, you have to know that the report was good, and he's overjoyed when he gets that report. Timothy and Silas come to him and basically tell him that in spite of the fact that he left quickly, there's persecution, there's pressure, the church is thriving. They're doing very well. And so you have a tone of joy and thankfulness in the very first chapter and throughout the letter. Paul's happiness or thanksgiving is because the church is thriving. And that is remarkable considering the fact that, again, he was only with them for a few months. And although Silas and Timothy stayed back, they were on their own. And the report is that they're doing very well. I'd like you to turn to the first chapter of 1 Thessalonians, and as one final thing for these notes, I want you to read through that first chapter only and try to find examples of basically how the Thessalonians are doing, or give some examples of Paul's joy or thankfulness. And you'll find that there's many, but come to class prepared with multiple reasons for Paul's thanksgiving for how well the Thessalonians are doing.